And we are going to finish the 17th chapter of David Copperfield, which is called Somebody Turns Up. David has gone to the Heap household where Uriah and his mother live, and they are pumping him for all sorts of information. Then when who should hear this from outside but Mr. Micawber, who enters the house and asks to be presented. I could do no less under these circumstances than make Mr. Micawber known to Uriah Heep and his mother, which I accordingly did, and they abashed themselves before him. Mr. Micawber took a seat and waved his hand in his most courtly manner. "Any friend of my friend Copperfield," said Mr. Micawber, "has a personal claim upon myself." "We are too humble, sir," said Mrs. Heep, "my son and me, to be the friends of Master Copperfield. He has been so good to take his tea with us, and we are thankful to him for his company. Also to you, sir, for your notice." "Ma'am," returned Mr. Micawber with a bow, "you are very obliging. And what are you doing, Copperfield? Still in the wine trade?" I was excessively anxious to get Mr. Micawber away, and replied, with my hat in my hand and a very red face, I have no doubt, that I was a pupil at Dr. Strong's. "A pupil?" said Mr. Micawber, raising his eyebrows. "I am extremely happy to hear it, although a mind like my friend Copperfield's," to Uriah and Mrs. Heep, "does not require that cultivation which, without his knowledge of men and things, it would require. Still, it is a rich soil, teeming with latent vegetation. In short," said Mr. Micawber, smiling in another burst of confidence, "it is an intellect capable of getting up the classics to any extent." Mr. Micawber closed this handsome tribute by saying, "Mr. Heep, good evening. Mrs. Heep, your servant," and then walking out with me in his most fashionable manner, making a good deal of noise on the pavement with his shoes and humming a tune. It was a little inn where Mr. Micawber put up, and he occupied a little room in it, partitioned off from the commercial room and strongly flavored with tobacco smoke. Mrs. Micawber was amazed, but very glad to see me. I was very glad to see her, too, and after an affectionate greeting on both sides, sat down on the small sofa near her. "My dear," said Mr. Micawber, "if you will mention to Copperfield what our present position is, which I have no doubt he will like to know, I will go and look at the paper the while, and see whether anything turns up among the advertisements." "I thought you were at Plymouth, ma'am," I said to Mrs. Micawber as he went out. "Oh, my dear Master Copperfield," she replied, we went to Plymouth." "To be on the spot," I hinted. "Just so," said Mrs. Micawber, "to be on the spot, but the truth is, talent is not wanted in the custom-house. The local influence of my family was quite unavailing to obtain any employment in that department for a man of Mr. Micawber's abilities, apart from which," said Mrs. Micawber, lowering her voice, "this is between ourselves, our reception was cool." I said and thought that they ought to be ashamed of themselves. "Still, so it was," said Mrs. Micawber. "Under such circumstances, what could a man of Mr. Micawber's spirit do? But one obvious course was left, to borrow of that branch of my family the money to return to London, and to return at any sacrifice." "Then you all came back again, ma'am?" I said. "We all came back again," replied Mrs. Micawber. "Since then, I have consulted other branches of my family on the course which is the most expedient for Mr. Micawber to take, for I maintain that he must take some course, Master Copperfield," said Mrs. Micawber argumentatively. "It is clear that a family of 6, not including a domestic, cannot live upon air." "Certainly, ma'am," said I. "The opinion of those other branches of my family," pursued Mrs. Micawber, "is that Mr. Micawber should immediately turn his attention to the coal trade. Mr. Micawber was induced to think on inquiry that there might be an opening for a man of his talent in the Medway coal trade. Then, as Mr. Micawber very properly said, the first step to be taken clearly was to come and see the Medway, which we came and saw. I say we, Master Copperfield, for I never will," said Mrs. Micawber with emotion. "I never will desert Mr. Micawber." I murmured my admiration and approbation. "We have been here," said Mrs. Micawber, 3 days. Nothing has as yet turned up, and we are at present waiting for a remittance from London to discharge our pecuniary obligations at this hotel." I felt the utmost sympathy for Mr. and Mrs. Micawber in this anxious extremity, and said as much to Mr. Micawber, who now returned, adding that I only wished I had money enough to lend them the amount they needed. Mr. Micawber's answer expressed the disturbance of his mind. He said, shaking hands with me, "Copperfield, you are a true friend, but when the worst comes to the worst, no man is without a friend who is possessed of shaving materials." At this dreadful hint, Mrs. Micawber threw her arms round Mr. Micawber's neck and entreated him to be calm. He wept, but so far recovered almost immediately as to ring the bell for the waiter, and bespeak a hot kidney pudding and a plate of shrimps for breakfast in the morning. When I took my leave of them, they both pressed me so much to come and dine before they went away that I could not refuse. We had a beautiful little dinner, quite an elegant dish of fish, the kidney end, and a loin of veal roasted, fried sausage meat, a partridge, and a pudding. There was wine, and there was strong ale, and after dinner Mrs. Micawber made us a bowl of hot punch with her own hands. Mr. Micawber was uncommonly convivial. I never saw him such good company. He made his face shine with the punch, so that it looked as if it had been varnished all over. As the punch disappeared, Mr. Micawber became still more friendly and convivial. Mrs. Micawber's spirits became elevated too. We sang Auld Lang Syne when we came to "Here's a hand, my trusty frere." We all joined hands round the table. In a word, I never saw anybody so thoroughly jovial as Mr. Micawber was, down to the very last moment of the evening. Consequently, I was not prepared at 7 o'clock next morning to receive the following communication, dated 9:30 in the evening, a quarter of an hour after I had left him. "My dear young friend, the die is cast all over, hiding the ravages of care with a sickly mask of mirth. I have not informed you this evening that there is no hope of the remittance. Under these circumstances alike, humiliating to endurance, humiliating to contemplate, and humiliating to relate, I have discharged the pecuniary liability contracted at this establishment by giving a note of hand, made payable 14 days after date, at my residence, Pentonville, London. When it becomes due, it will not be taken up. The result of destruction, the bolt is impending, and the tree must fall. Let the wretched man now address you, my dear Copperfield, be a beacon. Let the wretched man who now addresses you, my dear Copperfield, be a beacon to you through life. He writes with that intention, and in that hope. If he could think himself of so much use, one gleam of day might by possibility penetrate into the cheerless dungeon of his remaining existence, though his longevity is, at present, to say the least of it, extremely problematical. This is the last communication, my dear Copperfield, you will ever receive from the beleaguered outcast, Wilkins Micawber." I was so shocked by the contents of this heart-rending letter that I ran off directly toward the little hotel with the intention of trying to soothe Mr. Micawber with a word of comfort. But halfway there, I met the London coach with Mr. and Mrs. Micawber up behind. Mr. Micawber, the very picture of tranquil enjoyment, smiling at Mrs. Micawber's conversation, eating walnuts out of a paper bag with a bottle sticking out of his breast pocket. As they did not see me, I thought it best, all things considered, not to see them. So, with a great weight taken off my mind, I turned into a by-street that was the nearest way to school, and felt, upon the whole, relieved that they were gone. And that is the end of chapter 17.